Princess Zarathel had witnessed many species enter the royal chamber of the Caltharian Empire over her 3 centuries of life. She had seen the towering, crystalline Vorthak with their multiple arms gleaming like living jewels. She had watched the graceful, ethereal moonsingers float across the marble floors with their translucent wings catching the light. She had observed the massive, fur-covered Grimjaw warriors lumber forward with their battle scars, telling stories of 1,000 conflicts. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. The massive doors to the royal chamber groaned open, and the herald's voice echoed through the vast space. Presenting Ambassador James Mitchell, representing the human species of Earth. The words felt strange in the translator's mechanical tone. But it was the figure that stepped through those doors that made Zarathel's 4 hearts skip a beat. He was smaller than most species that came before her father's throne. Where the Grimjaw stood 9 feet tall, and the Vorthak reached 8 feet with their crystalline spikes, this human barely reached 6 feet in height. His build was lean but solid, like a blade forged from the finest metals. He wore simple dark clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and yet somehow he commanded more attention than any jewel-encrusted ambassador who had come before. But it was his eyes that captured her completely. They were brown, a color she had never seen in any sentient being's eyes before, warm like the richest soil, but sharp like polished metal. They swept across the chamber with a calmness that spoke of someone who had seen much and feared little. When those eyes briefly met hers across the vast space, Zarathel felt something she had never experienced before, a fluttering sensation in her chest that made her breathing quicken. The human walked forward with a stride that was neither hurried nor hesitant. Each step was deliberate, calculated, and confident. The other species in the chamber, advisors, guards, and nobles from across the galaxy, parted before him not because of his size or intimidating presence, but because of something else entirely. Something that made even the battle-hardened Grimjaw warriors step aside with what looked like respect. Emperor Kithron, Zarathel's father, sat on his throne of polished obsidian, his massive form draped in robes that sparkled with the light of distant stars. At 12 feet tall and weighing nearly a ton, he was an impressive sight that had made countless ambassadors tremble. His voice, when he spoke, could shake the very foundations of the palace. "Human," he rumbled, his words causing the crystal chandelier above to vibrate. "You come before the Caltharian Empire seeking what?" The human stopped at the traditional distance, 50 feet from the throne, the closest any being was allowed to approach the emperor without express permission. But instead of the usual bow or prostration that every species performed, he simply stood straight and tall. His voice when he spoke was calm and clear, carrying easily through the chamber without strain. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said, and there was something in his tone that made everyone in the chamber listen more carefully. "I come not seeking but offering. Humanity wishes to establish peaceful relations with your great empire. We offer friendship, trade, and mutual defense against the threats that lurk in the dark spaces between stars." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. No one had ever spoken to the emperor in such a direct manner. The proper protocol was to speak only when spoken to grovel and plead for the empire's consideration. This human had essentially walked in and proposed a partnership between equals. Emperor Kithron's eyes narrowed, and his massive clawed hands gripped the armrests of his throne. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "You speak boldly for such a small creature from an unknown world. What makes you think humanity has anything to offer an empire that spans 3,000 star systems?" The human, James, Zarathel reminded herself, smiled. It was a small expression, barely visible from where she sat, but somehow it lit up his entire face. "Because, Your Majesty, we humans have something that no other species in this galaxy possesses in quite the same way." "And what would that be?" the absolute refusal to give up. The silence that followed was deafening. Zarathel could see her father processing this statement, trying to understand what this small being meant. Around the chamber, translators worked frantically to ensure they had conveyed the human's words correctly to their various species. "Elaborate," the Emperor commanded. James took a step forward. It was technically a violation of protocol. But the Emperor's guards made no move to stop him. Something in the human's demeanor suggested that stopping him might be more difficult than it appeared. 3 years ago, James began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, our world was attacked by the Devourers. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. Every species knew of the Devourers, the mechanical swarm that consumed everything in its path, leaving nothing but empty space behind. They had destroyed 17 civilizations in the past century alone. Entire star systems had gone dark when the Devourers arrived. The first wave hit our outer colonies, James continued. We lost 12 million people in the first hour. Our fleet was outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Our weapons were inferior. Our ships were smaller and slower. By every logical calculation, humanity should have been consumed within a week. Zarathel leaned forward in her seat, hanging on every word. She had studied military history extensively, and she knew that no species had ever successfully repelled a full Devourer invasion. But we did not fall, James said simply. When they destroyed our ships, we built new ones from the wreckage. When they adapted to our weapons, we created new tactics. When they surrounded our worlds, we fought from inside their formations. When they thought they had won, we proved them wrong. The human's eyes swept across the chamber, and Zarathel felt that strange fluttering again when his gaze passed over her. We fought for 18 months. We lost billions of people. We sacrificed entire worlds to buy time for evacuation. We burned our own cities to deny them resources. And when the Devourers finally realized they could not consume us without losing more than they gained, they retreated. Emperor Kithron was leaning forward now, his massive bulk straining against his throne. Impossible. No species has ever forced the Devourers to retreat. No species has ever been human, Your Majesty. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device. With your permission, I would like to show you something. The Emperor nodded, and James activated the device. A holographic display materialized in the air above them, showing the Sol system, humanity's home. But it wasn't the blue and green world that most inhabited planets appeared to be. This was a system transformed by war. Earth was surrounded by massive orbital defense platforms, each one bristling with weapons that seemed to dwarf the ships around them. The moon had been converted into a fortress, its surface covered with gun emplacements and shield generators. The asteroid belt had been turned into a maze of hidden weapons platforms and supply depots. This is what humanity looks like after the war, James explained. We learned, we adapted, we improved. The Devourers taught us that the universe is a dangerous place, and we took that lesson to heart. The hologram shifted, showing human ships patrolling the outer system. They were sleek and deadly looking, unlike anything in the chamber had seen before. Their designs were purely functional, built for war and nothing else. But more importantly, James continued, we learned that we cannot face the darkness alone. The Devourers will return, in greater numbers and with new strategies. When they do, they will not just threaten humanity, they will threaten every species in this galaxy. And when that day comes, we will need allies. He deactivated the hologram and looked directly at the Emperor. That is what humanity offers the Caltharian Empire. Not just trade goods or diplomatic pleasantries, but the promise that when the worst comes, you will not stand alone. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Zarathel could see the wheels turning in her father's mind, weighing the human's words against everything he knew about galactic politics and military strategy. Finally, the Emperor spoke. "You claim your species defeated the Devourers through sheer determination, but determination alone does not win wars. What weapons do you possess? What technology?" James smiled again, and this time there was something almost predatory in the expression. "Your Majesty, with respect, you're asking the wrong question." "Then what should I be asking?" "You should be asking what we're willing to do to protect what we care about." James paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the chamber listen more carefully. "You see, every species in this galaxy fights to win. Humans fight to survive, and there is a universe of difference between those two motivations." Zarathel found herself studying the human's face, trying to understand what lay behind those calm brown eyes. There was something there, something that spoke of experiences beyond imagination. She had read about humans in the Imperial databases, a young species, barely spacefaring, with no significant military achievements. But the being standing before them seemed to represent something far more dangerous and complex than the files suggested. "3 days," Emperor Kithrin announced suddenly. "You will remain in the palace for 3 days. During that time, you will demonstrate these claims of human capability. If you prove worthy, we will discuss terms. If not—" He left the threat hanging in the air. James bowed his head slightly, the first sign of deference he had shown. "I am honored by your generosity, Your Majesty." As the formal audience concluded and the various ambassadors and nobles began to file out of the chamber, Zarathel remained in her seat, watching the human. He moved with the same confident stride as before, but she noticed now how his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, how his hands remained relaxed but ready, how he positioned himself to keep potential threats in view. He was a warrior, she realized. Not just a diplomat or representative, but someone who had seen real combat. The scars were there if you knew how to look, faint lines around his eyes from squinting in harsh light, a slight irregularity in his left hand that suggested old injury, the way he unconsciously favored his right side. As he reached the chamber doors, he turned back briefly. His eyes found hers across the vast space, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they simply looked at each other. Then he smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, and was gone. Zarathel sat in the empty chamber long after everyone else had left, trying to understand what had just happened to her. In all her centuries of life, she had never been affected by anyone the way this human had affected her. There was something about him that called to something deep within her, something she hadn't even known existed. She thought about his words, about humanity's war with the Devourers, about his claim that humans refused to give up. But more than that, she thought about the way he had looked at her, as if he could see straight through to her soul. 3 days, her father had said. 3 days to prove himself worthy. Zarathel found herself hoping, for the first time in her life, that a diplomatic negotiation would succeed, because she very much wanted to see what else this human warrior was capable of. The next morning brought unexpected opportunities. Zarathel had spent a sleepless night thinking about the human ambassador, and she found herself walking through the palace gardens earlier than usual, hoping to clear her thoughts. The morning sun cast long shadows through the crystalline trees, and the air hummed with the gentle vibrations of the palace's energy systems. She was surprised to find James already there, sitting quietly on a bench near the meditation pools. He wasn't doing anything particularly remarkable, just sitting and watching the water flow over the luminescent stones, but there was something about his stillness that drew her attention. Most species she knew were always in motion, always fidgeting or making noise. The Grimjaw could never sit still for more than a few minutes. The Vorthak constantly shifted their crystalline limbs. Even her own people tended to pace when thinking. But this human sat with a perfect stillness that seemed almost unnatural, yet completely relaxed. "Ambassador Mitchell," she called softly as she approached. He turned at the sound of her voice, and that warm smile crossed his features again. "Your Highness, please call me James, and I hope you'll forgive me for being in your gardens without permission. I needed some quiet time to think." "No forgiveness necessary," she replied, settling onto the bench beside him. Up close, she could see details that had been hidden in the vast royal chamber. His dark hair had threads of silver at the temples, suggesting he was older than he appeared. His hands bore small scars that spoke of a lifetime of physical work and combat. "I often come here for the same reason. What occupies your thoughts this morning?" James was quiet for a moment, his brown eyes reflecting the dancing light from the water. "I was thinking about my daughter," he said finally. "She would have loved this place. The way the light moves through the crystal trees, the sound of the water. She always said that beautiful things made her feel closer to understanding the universe." Zarathel noticed the past tense and felt a pang of sympathy. Would have? She was on one of the colonies when the Devourers attacked. Luna Colony, a research station studying interstellar navigation. She was only 22, just starting her career as an astrophysicist. His voice remained steady, but Zarathel could see the pain in his eyes. The colony's last transmission said the Devourers had broken through the outer defenses. No one survived. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with grief and loss. Zarathel found herself wanting to reach out, to offer some comfort, but she wasn't sure how. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I can't imagine such a loss." James nodded slowly. "It's why I'm here, really. Not just as an ambassador, but as a father who wants to make sure no other parent has to watch their children disappear into the dark." He turned to look at her, and she was struck again by the intensity in his eyes. "Your people have children too, don't they? Families worth protecting?" "Of course," she replied. "Family bonds are sacred to us." "Then you understand why I can't fail in this mission. Why failure isn't an option for humanity." Before Zarathel could respond, a commotion arose from the direction of the palace. Shouts echoed across the gardens, and she could see guards running toward the main courtyard. Both she and James rose from the bench immediately. "What's happening?" she asked, but James was already moving toward the sound, his relaxed demeanor replaced by the alert intensity of a warrior. They reached the courtyard to find chaos. General Korvik, the Emperor's chief military advisor and a massive Grimjaw warrior, was bellowing orders at a squad of palace guards. In the center of the courtyard stood a training arena where combat demonstrations were occasionally held for visiting dignitaries. "The human thinks he can demonstrate his species' capabilities," Korvik was roaring to anyone who would listen. "Let him try to impress us with whatever pathetic skills his soft people possess." Zarathel felt her heart sink. Korvik was known for his arrogance and his belief that only the Grimjaw truly understood warfare. He had clearly decided to test the human publicly, probably hoping to embarrass him and end the diplomatic talks before they could begin. James, however, seemed unperturbed by the hostile atmosphere. He walked calmly to the edge of the arena, where Korvik was waiting with a selection of weapons from various species, energy swords from the Vorthak, plasma rifles from the Moonsingers, and massive warhammers favored by the Grimjaw. "Choose your weapon, human," Korvik growled, his fangs gleaming in the morning light. "I will show you how real warriors fight." The crowd that had gathered murmured with anticipation. Zarathel noticed several nobles who had been present during the previous day's audience, all watching with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. James examined the weapon selection carefully, then shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, General, but I'll use my own equipment if you don't mind." He reached into his jacket and withdrew two items that made the crowd gasp. The first was a knife. Not the ornate ceremonial blades that most species carried, but a simple, deadly-looking piece of metal with a matte black finish. The second was a small device that Zarathel didn't recognize. "A knife?" Korvik laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "You face a grim-jaw warrior with a knife?" "It served me well so far," James replied mildly. He activated the small device, and suddenly the air around him shimmered. Zarathel realized it was some kind of personal energy shield. But unlike any she had seen before, instead of the bright, obvious barriers used by most species, this created only the faintest distortion, almost invisible. Korvik selected a massive warhammer that was nearly as tall as James himself. The weapon crackled with energy fields designed to shatter armor and bone alike. "This will be over quickly," he announced. The fight began immediately. Korvik charged forward with surprising speed for his massive frame, bringing the warhammer down in an overhead strike that would have crushed most beings into paste. James simply wasn't there when the hammer arrived. What followed was unlike any combat Zarathel had ever witnessed. Korvik was a skilled warrior with centuries of experience and the raw physical power to shatter stone with his bare hands. But James moved like liquid shadow, always exactly where the massive Grimjaw's attacks weren't. He flowed around strikes that should have been impossible to avoid, ducked under swings that came from unexpected angles, and somehow always managed to be behind his opponent when Korvik expected him to be in front. The human's knife work was a thing of beauty. He didn't try to overpower Korvik's defenses. Instead, he found the tiny gaps in the Grimjaw's armor, the joints where movement required flexibility. Each strike was precise, calculated, and devastating. He wasn't trying to kill his opponent, Zarathel realized, but to systematically disable him. Within 5 minutes, Korvik was on his knees, his warhammer lying useless several feet away. James stood behind him, the knife resting gently against the general's throat just above his armor line. "Do you yield, General?" James asked politely. The crowd was dead silent. Korvik, breathing heavily, nodded slowly. "I yield." James immediately stepped back and offered his hand to help the massive warrior to his feet. Korvik stared at the offered hand for a moment, then grasped it and allowed himself to be pulled upright. "You fight well, human," Korvik admitted grudgingly. "But this was only single combat. War is different." "You're absolutely right," James agreed. He looked around at the assembled crowd, his eyes finding Emperor Kithron, who had appeared on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. "Single combat tells you very little about a species' military capabilities. Would you like a more comprehensive demonstration?" The Emperor nodded slowly. "Proceed." James activated his communication device. "Mitchell to resolve. We're ready for the demonstration." The response came immediately, and every translator in the courtyard worked frantically to render it into understandable language. "Acknowledged, Ambassador. Beginning atmospheric entry now." Zarathel looked up to see what appeared to be shooting stars beginning to streak across the sky. But as they grew closer, she realized they weren't meteors. They were ships, human ships, entering the atmosphere at speeds that should have torn them apart. The ships were unlike anything she had ever seen. They were smaller than most military vessels, but they moved with a precision and grace that was almost biological. As they approached the palace, they began to perform maneuvers that defied everything she knew about aerospace engineering. One ship dove toward the ground at an angle that should have resulted in a crash, then pulled out at the last second to skim just above the treetops. Another performed a series of corkscrewing turns that would have liquefied any pilot from another species. A third somehow managed to stop in midair, hovering impossibly, without any visible means of support. Then they began to dance. There was no other word for it. The 12 ships moved in perfect synchronization, weaving between each other in patterns so complex that Zarathel's eyes could barely follow them. They formed geometric shapes in the sky, then dissolved into flowing streams of movement that somehow never resulted in collisions, despite coming within meters of each other at tremendous speeds. "This is our standard patrol formation," James explained calmly as the ships continued their aerial ballet above them. "Each pilot is operating independently, reacting to the movements of the others in real time. No central coordination, no computer assistance beyond basic flight controls." General Korvik was staring at the sky with his mouth open. Impossible. The reaction time required, the spatial awareness. No biological being could process information that quickly. "Humans can," James said simply, "when we need to." The demonstration continued for several more minutes, showing formations and maneuvers that left the assembled crowd speechless. Finally, the ships formed a perfect diamond formation and accelerated straight up, disappearing into the upper atmosphere in seconds. "Your pilots?" Emperor Kithrin called down from his balcony. "They are enhanced? Cybernetic implants? Genetic modification?" James shook his head. "Completely unmodified humans, Your Majesty. Though they are among our best. The pilot who led that formation is a woman named Captain Sarah Chen. She's been flying for 15 years, and she's lost more friends to war than most species lose in their entire military careers. But she keeps flying because someone has to." The Emperor was quiet for a long moment. "And how many such pilots does humanity possess?" "Every human can learn to fly like that, given proper training and motivation," James replied. "We've had to. The universe taught us that anything less than excellence means extinction." As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with conversation about what they had witnessed, Zarathel found herself walking beside James as he returned to the gardens. "That was remarkable," she said. "I've never seen anything like it." "It's what we do," he replied. "We adapt. We improve. We refuse to accept that something is impossible just because it's difficult." He paused beside the meditation pool where they had been sitting earlier. "Your people have the same potential, Princess. Every species does. The difference is that most have never been forced to find their absolute limits." Zarathel studied his face, seeing something there that she was beginning to understand. "You didn't just fight the Devourers, did you? You learned from them." James smiled, and this time there was something almost sad in the expression. "We learned that the universe doesn't care about fair fights or honorable combat. We learned that survival requires being willing to do whatever it takes to push beyond what you think is possible. To never give up, even when giving up would be logical. And you want to teach that to others? I want to make sure that when the darkness comes again, and it will come, we're all strong enough to face it together." He looked at her directly, and Zarathel felt that strange fluttering in her chest again. "Because the alternative is that we face it alone, one species at a time, until there's nothing left." The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the garden. Somewhere in the distance, Zarathel could hear the faint sound of the palace's evening bells beginning to chime. "2 more days," she murmured. "2 more days," James agreed. "And then we'll see if your father believes humanity is worth the risk of alliance." As they stood together in the gathering twilight, Zarathel found herself hoping with everything she had that the next 2 days would convince her father to see what she was beginning to see. That this human warrior might be exactly what their empire needed. The 3rd day arrived with an emergency that no one had anticipated. Zarathel was awakened before dawn by the harsh sound of the palace's alert systems. The crystal walls of her chambers pulsed with urgent red light, and her personal communicator was buzzing with incoming messages. She activated it to find her father's aide, a nervous moonsire named Veltar, hovering anxiously on the holographic display. "Your Highness," Veltar said, his translucent wings fluttering with agitation. "The Emperor requires your immediate presence in the war room. We have a situation." The war room was a massive chamber deep within the palace, its walls covered with displays showing the current status of the entire Caltharian Empire. When Zarathel arrived, she found it filled with military officers from a dozen different species, all talking at once in various languages, while translation devices worked frantically to keep up. Emperor Kithron stood at the center of it all, his massive frame tense with controlled anger. General Korvik was beside him, his earlier defeat by James apparently forgotten in the face of whatever crisis they were dealing with. Admiral Theska, a Vorthak commander whose crystalline form refracted the light from the displays into prismatic rainbows, was pointing at a large holographic map. "The attack began 2 hours ago," Admiral Theska was explaining. 3 border systems under simultaneous assault. The attackers appeared without warning and overwhelmed our defensive positions before they could send more than basic distress signals. "Who?" the Emperor demanded. "Which species dares attack the Empire?" "That's the problem, Your Majesty," Admiral Theska replied, her crystalline voice chiming with uncertainty. "The attacking ships don't match any known design. They're strange. Organic-looking, but clearly technological, and they're using weapons we've never encountered before." Zarathel felt her blood turn cold as the implications became clear. Around the room, she could see the same realization dawning on other faces. "Devourers?" someone whispered. "It appears so," Admiral Theska confirmed. "But these ships are different from the ones in our databases, more advanced, more efficient." The room erupted into panicked chatter. The Devourers were the nightmare that haunted every species in the galaxy, the unstoppable force that had consumed 17 civilizations without ever being successfully repelled. If they had returned with new technology, more advanced ships. "Silence!" Emperor Kithron's voice boomed across the room, immediately stilling all conversation. "How long until they reach the core systems?" "At their current rate of advance," Admiral Theska calculated, "approximately 18 hours until they reach the inner defensive perimeter. 36 hours until they reach the capital system." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. 36 hours to prepare for an enemy that had never been defeated. An enemy that grew stronger with each victory by consuming the technology and resources of its victims. "Your Majesty." The quiet voice from the back of the room made everyone turn. James had entered the war room unnoticed, and now he stood near the entrance, his calm presence somehow steadying in the midst of all the panic. "Ambassador," the Emperor acknowledged. "You hear our situation. Your species claims to have defeated these creatures once. What counsel do you offer?" James walked forward, studying the tactical displays as he moved. His brown eyes took in the formations, the attack vectors, the defensive positions with the keen attention of someone who had spent years learning to read such information. "With respect, Your Majesty, you're thinking about this wrong," he said finally. General Korvik bristled at the perceived insult. "How dare you suggest that the Empire's military leadership doesn't understand warfare? Because you're trying to fight the Devourers the way you'd fight any other enemy," James replied calmly. "But they're not any other enemy. They're a force of nature, like a hurricane or an avalanche. You don't defeat a hurricane by standing in its path and trying to be stronger than it." "Then how do you defeat it?" Emperor Kithron asked. James smiled, and there was something fierce and determined in the expression. "You make it not worth the cost of winning." He activated his communication device. "Mitchell to resolve. We're facing a code-black scenario. Initiate Harbinger Protocol." The response came immediately. Acknowledged, Ambassador. Harbinger Protocol is active. ETA to target system. 6 hours. Around the room, the assembled officers began talking again, but James wasn't finished. Admiral Thessica, I need to see the exact composition of the attacking force and their current positions. The Vorthak Admiral hesitated, looking to the Emperor for permission. At Kithran's nod, she activated a detailed tactical display showing the 3 systems under attack. James studied the display for several minutes, his face growing more serious with each passing moment. They're not random attacks, he said finally. Look at the pattern. These 3 systems form a triangle, with the capital system at the center. They're not trying to conquer territory. They're establishing a siege. A siege? Zarathel asked. They're going to surround the core systems and then slowly consume everything inside the perimeter. No escape, no reinforcement, no hope of outside assistance. James's voice was grim. It's a new strategy for them, more sophisticated than their previous approach of simply consuming everything in their path. The implication was terrifying. If the Devourers had learned to think strategically, to plan and coordinate their attacks instead of simply overwhelming their enemies with brute force. Can this Harbinger Protocol of yours stop them? Emperor Kithran asked. Maybe, James replied honestly. It depends on how much they've learned since our last encounter. But there's something else you need to understand about humans, Your Majesty. He turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying clearly to every corner despite speaking at normal volume. Every other species in this galaxy fights to win. Humans fight to survive. And there is one thing that every species needs to understand about what that difference means. The room was silent, waiting. When humans fight to survive, we don't fight alone. At that moment, new contacts began appearing on the tactical displays. Ships were dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the capital system. Not just a few ships, but hundreds of them. The displays lit up with identification signals as the new arrivals announced themselves. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Human Defense Force ship Indomitable. We are responding to Ambassador Mitchell's call for assistance. This is Commander Zhang Wei aboard the strike carrier Valiant. Our fighter squadrons are ready for immediate deployment. This is Admiral Sarah Chen commanding the Dreadnought Resolve. All ships assume formation Alpha 7 and prepare for coordinated attack. The names kept coming, each ship announcing its readiness and taking position in a formation that seemed impossibly complex. Zarathel watched the display with growing amazement as she realized what she was seeing. You brought an entire fleet, she whispered. Not just any fleet, James corrected. This is the Terran Defense Force, every ship, every pilot, every Marine who survived the war against the Devourers. We've been traveling together for 3 years, visiting potential allies, hoping to build the coalition we know we'll need for the next war. He gestured at the display, where the human ships were now moving into position between the Devourer forces and the capital system. But more than that, when humans fight to survive, we remember what we're fighting for. Every pilot out there has lost someone to these creatures. Every gunner, every engineer, every Marine has seen what the Devourers do to the worlds they consume. They're not fighting for territory or honor or conquest. The tactical display updated as the human fleet engaged the Devourer forces in the outer system. The battle was unlike anything anyone in the room had ever seen. The human ships moved with the same precision and coordination they had demonstrated in atmosphere, but now scaled up to fleet level. They're fighting for their children, James continued, his voice steady despite the massive battle playing out on the screens. For their homes, for their families, for the future of every species in this galaxy. The Devourers had superior numbers and their ships were larger, but the humans fought with a tactical sophistication that was breathtaking to watch. They used the Devourers' own size against them, luring the massive ships into formations where they couldn't bring their full firepower to bear. They coordinated attacks across multiple vectors simultaneously, forcing the enemy to divide their attention, and they never gave up. When human ships took damage, they kept fighting until they physically couldn't continue. When formations were broken, they regrouped and attacked again. When the odds turned against them, they adapted new strategies in real time. "Captain Rodriguez, your ship is venting atmosphere." Admiral Chen's voice crackled over the communications system. "Acknowledged, Admiral. Still have weapons and engines. We're staying in the fight." "Negative, Captain. Fall back to safe distance." "With respect, Admiral, there is no safe distance if these things break through. Rodriguez out." The damaged human ship continued to fight, its weapon systems spitting defiance at enemies that outmassed it 50-1. For 6 hours, the battle raged across 3 star systems. The Caltharian forces watched in amazement as humanity demonstrated why they had been the first and only species to successfully repel a devourer invasion. It wasn't superior technology or overwhelming firepower, it was the absolute refusal to accept defeat. When the last devourer ship finally retreated into hyperspace, the silence in the war room was deafening. "Damage report." Admiral Chen's voice came over the speakers, calm and professional despite having just commanded one of the most remarkable military victories in galactic history. 18 ships total loss, 47 ships with major damage, minor damage across the fleet, came the response. Casualties, 4,300 dead, 8,000 wounded. The numbers hit the war room like physical blows. The humans had paid a terrible price for their victory, but they had paid it without hesitation. Admiral Chen, Emperor Kithron, spoke into the communication system, his massive voice carrying all the authority of his position. "This is Emperor Kithron of the Caltharian Empire. On behalf of all our people, I thank you for your service today." "The honor was ours, Your Majesty," Admiral Chen replied. "Ambassador Mitchell, are the negotiations concluded?" All eyes in the room turned to Emperor Kithron. The massive ruler stood in silence for a long moment, processing everything he had witnessed. "Ambassador Mitchell," he said finally, "I believe we have much to discuss regarding this alliance you propose." James smiled, and for the first time since Zarathel had met him, he looked truly relaxed. "I believe we do, Your Majesty." Later that evening, after the formal treaties had been signed and the celebration had begun in the great halls of the palace, Zarathel found James once again in the garden by the meditation pools. This time he wasn't alone. Admiral Chen was with him, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much war. "Princess," Admiral Chen said with a respectful nod as Zarathel approached. "Your people fought bravely today. Your defensive fleet performed admirably." "Thank you, Admiral, though I think we both know who won this battle." "We won it together," Admiral Chen corrected. "And that's the point. The Devourers will be back with new strategies and new ships. When they come, we'll face them together, all of us." She excused herself, leaving James and Zarathel alone beside the pools. The crystal trees reflected the stars above, creating patterns of light that seemed to dance in the gentle evening breeze. "So what happens now?" Zarathel asked. "Your mission is complete. Will you return to Earth?" James was quiet for a moment, his brown eyes reflecting the starlight. "Actually, your father has asked me to remain as the permanent human ambassador to the Empire. Someone needs to coordinate the defensive preparations, help train your forces in anti-devourer tactics." "And you accepted?" "I did." He turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her hearts flutter again. "I found that I have reasons to want to stay." The words hung in the air between them, full of implication and possibility. Zarathel felt her face warming as she realized what he meant. "James," she said softly, "I need you to know that I've never felt this way about anyone before. In 3 centuries of life, no one has ever made me feel the way you make me feel. And how is that? She struggled to find the right words. Like I've been asleep my entire life and I'm just now waking up. Like there are possibilities I never imagined. Like the universe is bigger and more wonderful and more dangerous than I ever understood. He stepped closer, and she could see the warmth in his brown eyes. Zarathel, I came here as an ambassador, representing my species in formal negotiations. But somewhere along the way, this became personal. You became important to me in a way I didn't expect. Important how? Important enough that when I think about the future we're building, about the alliance between our peoples and the battles we'll fight together, I can't imagine doing any of it without you beside me. The words were simple, direct, and honest. Everything she had come to expect from this remarkable human. There was no flowery poetry or elaborate courtship ritual, just the straightforward truth of someone who had learned that life was too short and too precious to waste time on anything but honesty. The universe is a dangerous place, she said, echoing words he had spoken days earlier. Yes, he agreed, but it's also beautiful, and it's worth fighting for. She looked up at the stars, thinking about everything that had happened in the past 3 days. A human warrior had walked into her life and changed everything, not just for her personally, but for her entire civilization. The Empire was now part of something larger, something that might actually stand a chance against the darkness that lurked between the stars. When the Devourers return, she said, we'll be ready. Yes, James said, taking her hand in his. We will. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, bearing witness to the beginning of an alliance that would reshape the galaxy. And somewhere in the distance, barely visible against the cosmic background, a human fleet maintained its vigilant watch, ready to stand between the light and the dark for as long as breath remained in their bodies. The universe was vast and dangerous and full of wonders beyond imagination. And for the first time in her 3 centuries of life, Princess Zarathel was ready to explore all of it, and perhaps, she thought with a flutter of emotions she didn't quite understand, exactly what she needed as well.